Good morning. Welcome. My name is Davide Nicolini. I am a sociologist of work currently based in a business school. And I have the privilege of welcoming you to this very interesting meeting. I have to say I'm not used to speak with all this light and this podium in front of me. And it's very dangerous because if we are authentic to our approach, the practice of speaking in the podium creates monsters. Okay? So, I will not give you too much information about myself because we have the luxury of spending 2 days here. So we can do this little by little. We can sort of reveal our backgrounds and make connections between our backgrounds and our current studies. And for the same reasons also, I discussed with the organizers, and I took upon myself to make a broad introduction to these 2 days, knowing that unlike the usual crazy conveyor belt of traditional conference, when you have 20 minutes to compress months and months of work and thinking, we have the luxury of 2 days. So I thought, let's take our time, let's expand time. So let's introduce some of the themes, and then some of the themes then be covered in depth later on. So what I'm going to do in the next 35 minutes is just set the scene for the conversations. And then, as I said, with the hope that little by little we'll go in depth. And I'm really looking forward to hear Professor Schmidt speaking in English, because he usually speaks in German. And that's, for me, it is a little bit of a problem. And so bear with me when I introduce these things. I hope I don't leave too many questions unanswered, but that is actually the purpose of setting not only the scene, but also some of the questions that we can discuss over the next 2 days. So, first of all, I would like to just confess that I'm a little bit constrained by the idea of speaking about practice theory. And then in the next couple of days, we'll have an opportunity to expand on this. But within the people who are interested in this particular take on social sciences, there's a little bit of a division. Practice theory has become, or is associated with a number of very specific authors. And while I take a practice approach, or Professor Smith's idea of praxeologizing the phenomenon as a broader church, a broader family. So this morning, I'd like to speak using generic terms like practice approach, practice-based studies, practice studies, praxeology as a family, as an umbrella term. So when I speak about these things, I refer to a family of approaches. The focus on the regime of ordinary activities as the basis to understand and explain social, organizational, and economic phenomena. So it's really a broad approach that takes regimes of ordinary actions, okay? So ordinary actions that have a history, that perpetuate in time, that have a constituency, as the unit of analysis. And there are many other competitive, alternative way of doing social science. You can take the individuals as the basic unit of analysis, and this is what economics does, psychology, or some type of psychologies. And common sense has, of course, interiorized, adopted the methodological individualist approach. Or you can take systems as the basic unit of analysis. I just named persons, so it can be remembered, Niklas Luhmann. Or you can take classes, and you're a Marxist. So practice is a particular way, a particular choice that you make. We can have a different discussions whether you choose the paradigms or you're chosen by it, but it's a different story. So, practice-based studies, practice approaches, or practice theory in inverted comma, because, as I'm trying to say, it's not a proper theory. It's For me, when we talk about these things, we talk about, in fact, not about a theory in the traditional sense of a set of statements with logical connections, but we're talking about a device for doing social theory. And I have to confess that I come here as an empirical researcher. I am an empirical sociologist who has sort of refined or trying to give shape to the practical ontology that I work. I come from philosophy, so I can do this. But I am basically a person who goes in the hospitals, goes into factories, goes into organizations, and do ethnography, talk with people, take videos, take pictures. So for me, practice theory is less of a set of statements, of a way of talking about the world, and more a package of theory, method, and literary genre. Literary genre being just a way of writing, a style of writing, okay? Sort of respond to the questions. If I want to write work, I want to write the work of somebody, or want to write, where do I start? How do I write work? So, in my view, this practice approach is a combination of three things. First, an ontological set of statements. An ontology is a particular type of theory, okay? It's a theory that speaks or that constructs a word for you and then gives you handle for the empirical research. So you may have an explicit ontology and then you're a philosopher, but you can also have an implicit ontology. What you look for or what you see when you go in the field and you look for social phenomena. So practice theory or practice approaches is an ontology that, as said, takes regimes of ordinary actions as the place to start social research. It's also a set of methods and strategy, and we will discuss this tomorrow, okay, that help you interrogate the world according to this assumption. What I'm trying to say is that if you are interested in doing practice theory, you cannot just say the world is made of practice, or we have to start talking or start discussing from the vantage point of ordinary action. Then you have to have the tools and the methodological options that allows you to do that, okay? Because otherwise the methodology will take you somewhere else. And again, I don't want to go into this part because I think we have the whole day tomorrow for discussing. And the third thing that is part of this package, as I said, is a literary genre. Is some indications of how do I write practice and what sort of theory or what sort of theorization is a theorization that's tended to practice. And for this, I think the best thing to do is to use the words of one of our cousins, okay? Latour was very, very, as usual, very explicit and very clear, very eloquent about the fact that every approach which puts actions or activity of real-time activity at the center is also, first and foremost, a style of writing. So remember, ethnography has two bits, ethnos and graphos. Now, looking at other cultures is relatively easy. Actually, ethnographers know that the real trick is when you sit down and try to write it. That's where the trouble starts, okay? So there you go. You can read this by yourself. Okay. So the challenge not only that of having this good idea of slicing the words in terms of practices, then looking and having the methods that allows you to see these practices, that makes you see something else. But then the question is also, how do we write it down? Am I in the way? I see people ducking. Okay. So the text in our discipline is, it's not just a story, okay? It's the functional equivalent of a laboratory. It's a place for trial, experiments, and simulations. You only stop when you have convincingly represented practices. Of course, Latour says you only stop when you represent a network, but the sense what's for practice. So, practice approach as a toolkit, as a package, as a whole, as a combination of these three things. Now, one of the complications of the practice of this approach is that there is no such a thing as practice theory. I think this is something that everybody who's in this field agrees. And that's why I call it practice theory is dangerous, because practice theory has been associated with one of the branches of this particular family, which is actually what we could call the post-Wittgensteinian or post-Heideggerian theory of practice, which is a very, very interesting, a very rich thread in this discussion, but not the only one by its means. So you can enter practice theory in different ways, and this is my particular view, is that you can actually build on a number of these existing, some of them very old and very established traditions. And the reasons being, as we'll see in a minute, I believe they are connected by a number of family resemblances. So all these approaches do share a number of similarities in deontologies that allows you to work or to borrow between them, so to speak, if you're so inclined, okay? Unless, of course, you belong to the ethnomethodological church, and then you may want to be ethnomethodological orthodox. The important thing is that in the view of those who do have embraced this approach, is that this particularly set, so this package of theory, methods, and literary genre, either derive from one of the disciplines that you see, the tradition that you see behind me, or a combination of those. The trick is that this, the claim is that this particular approach allows you to do things that are dramatically different from other types of social theory. So Franz just told us that practice theory is extremely effective in turning upside down a number of assumptions of Cartesian world, okay? But it's also good of sort of taking a stance of position itself different from other cousins. So, for example, and this is, I think, something that we'll discuss in the next sections, okay? So the idea is that practice theory is part itself in a larger family of approaches that, for which I don't have a name. Some of my colleagues call them process approaches to social science. Somebody called STS plus, okay? But practice theory tried to carve itself a particular niche in comparison with other competing approaches. And so the idea here is that the obvious comparison is with actor-nectar theory. As you will see, and we can discuss during these days, there are a number of similarities, but also a number of differences with actor-nectar theory. So this theory method package allows you, or should allow you, to do something slightly different and make you see things that other approaches don't, okay? So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to take you, so what are some of these assumptions that differentiate practice theories from other type of ways of doing social theory? And then I will give you a quick example and conclude with 5 brief challenges that are open to the practice theory. And I will go a little bit fast, but as I said, we can always come back to this in the next few days. And that's good. So, first assumptions of practice that is shared. So we're talking about here things that all the traditions in the flowers that I showed before will more or less agree, okay? So the first assumptions that things everybody agree is that ordinary actions is key to understand and explain social and organizational phenomena. So ordinary actions is a obligatory point of passage or a necessary component of everything social. And this is a great revolution. And it's a great revolution for whom we have to thank people like Pierre Bourdieu, Giddens, or the previous generations, the first generations of practice theory. Okay? Because until then, ordinary actions was, in the best of cases, the product of something else. Okay? So an epiphenomenon, something that comes after. In most cases, it was just non-interesting. Okay? And some of you may be familiar with this. Okay? The work of Pierre Bourdieu has one keystone. Do you know the keystone? The keystone is the piece of stone that when you make an arch, there is a piece of stone at the center that takes all the pressure. And it's the last bit to go in. If you do an arch, you put a scaffold, you put the stones, and then you put the keystones. And the keystones has to be very nicely shaped and keeps the arch going for up to 2,000 years, even more, okay? So Pierre Bourdieu thought that ordinary actions, that the practice is actually the keystone, is the moment of truth where his famous circuits of reproductions, the fields, are produced or not produced. And that's the great genius of Pierre Bourdieu, that, or one of the many, okay? To take down things like French academia or the household in Algeria, or this enormously complex phenomena, being produced or reproduced in mundane, ordinary setting like the dining room of the middle class in Paris, okay? And you can read by yourself, okay? A whole cosmology, okay? A whole way of living, a whole structure in society is reproduced not through grand theory, grand structures, but small things like parents say, sit straight at the table because this is the way you should behave, okay? Or you have to go to university because this is what we do in our family. Okay? This is how middle class is reproduced, through this small, located, situated, mundane activity. So the idea is that it's here that you have to start in order to understand large social phenomena. The return of ordinary actions. And in English, we have the discussions, actually, some doctors told me that in some sociologists use the word mundane. In English, mundane has a slightly negative connotations. And some of our doctors says, we don't do mundane things, we do ordinary things. But they're not mundane at all. And I think that's the message of practice theory. Second assumption of this practice approach is that most of these ordinary actions are performed as part of conventionalized ways of doing. So they don't just happen in isolations. They are part of longer sequences or larger wholes. And when some activities becomes identified, can be located within these larger wholes, we call them practices. Okay? So I can go on here, and we can do this later on. A lot of theorists have suggested that practice is actually a medium-sized, what psychologists call a molar construct, that they are composed, so that every practice is composed of smaller activity, so the act of actually writing or typing on the keyboard can be part either of the practice of academic writing or the act of writing on the internet, okay? So I write, for example, so I can be a sort of part-time poet, which is the art. So practice, as especially traditions like activity theory made a strong case, practice is what gives sense, gives meaning to this small activity. So, okay, so turning on the faucet, turning on the tap in the water can be part of washing, or can be part of cleaning, or can be part of cooking. But it's the practice of cooking that makes sense, so you don't wash the pasta in Italy. I'm Italian. You don't wash the pasta after you cook it. You ruin it, okay? So, okay. So the turning on the tap, it makes and when makes a big difference depending on the practice. So if you're washing the dishes and washing the pasta, it's two different practices, and opening the tap assume a very big difference. So ordinary actions become meaningful as part of this larger whole. And the important thing is that, and the interesting thing is that this is one of the rare occasions where banking on the view of the practitioner, so thinking like going native, is actually not forbidden. As you know, using native's concept to describe reality in many situations can be a very bad idea for social theorists. Okay? As I think Professor Smith will explain later on, because doing practice theory is very much trying to see the world as it's produced from the perspective of the practitioners. The practitioner will know what is a practice. But we'll come back to this. So examples of practice, examples of, as I said, regimes of ordinary activities, okay? Regimes means something that continues in time, that has a lot of people doing it, okay? That it has a history. Doing a class, writing academic papers, I chose the example on purpose. Will you speak tomorrow about this? Yes. Shopping for food, doing the washing, performing heart surgery. This is actually all practices that have been studied. Some I did, some I didn't. So this all practices that have been studied, and tomorrow we'll discuss how. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the world, organizations, institutions, the family, middle class, the West, as built of these type of things. And the third assumption, these slides will be available, so you don't have to transcribe them really fast. I'm really sorry. I actually sent them yesterday. I thought you may have it in your pack. So the third assumption is that practice and then configurations and dynamics can be used to be explained other phenomena. And this is very important, because if all these practice things is just sitting in rooms and just agonizing about what is a practice, what is the definitions of a practice, what is not a practice, it's a waste of time. In my view, and I take responsibility, but I don't assume that everybody thinks like me, but in my view, practice theory is as I said at the beginning, an ontology and a literary genre to do social research, to explain other phenomena, okay? And the idea is to explain things like meaning, knowledgeability, social change, sustainability in terms of practice as emerging from a combinations, associations, tension between, connections, assemblage of regimes of ordinary actions, okay? So the school system in the Netherlands is actually composed of a variety of practice, including everybody at this time. There's probably thousands of people doing classes. There's thousands of administrators in rooms doing typing on computers and doing filing. There's thousands of people in the basement of the schools doing cleaning, okay? This is what the system of schooling in the Netherlands look like for practice theory. And we'll see tomorrow, that's the challenge is how do we study this? But as I said, one step at a time, okay? So practice theory as a theory method package. Practice theory is, okay, as an effort to apply these three basic fundamental ontological assumptions. So what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to show you, try to give you an idea, an example of how this works. And then we conclude very briefly with some challenges. I think we have time for this. Is that okay? So we're going to take a big bite, okay? Why starting with small things? So how does, or how could, and I don't, how could we apply this approach to the study of bureaucracy? Okay? I was thinking why I should start presenting my own work instead of going to this flight of imaginations, but I'll see in a minute. So, I'm using this because I was assuming, seeing all your titles, and you're all familiar with the Old Master, okay? So this is, so we all know that Max Weber, who is a giant in many ways, but he had a very particular way of approaching phenomena. And his attempt of describing bureaucracy, I think you're familiar with it, is through a number of principles that he was thinking regulates the large organizations. So let's go and see what happens if instead of looking bureaucracy as the applications of general principles, and I apologize if there are some proper Weberians here. I assure you that I did my reading and I actually love the man, but so I needed somebody to compare with, okay? So let's go and see how does actually practice theory looks, bureaucracy looks if you take a practice theory and you put to work the three assumptions. Those of you who do empirical work knows very well that artists are normally much better than we are in capture reality. Fortunately, they do a different work, otherwise we will be all without job. I like this because it's a very humorous, but it's in many ways a very detailed, very profound study of queuing in a bureaucratical setting. And if I had to study queuing, I'm not sure that I would be able to convey as many things as Luz has conveyed. But I think this is a very good contrast to Weber's depictions of the principle of bureaucracy, okay? This is what bureaucracy looks from a practice perspective, okay? First thing, action and ordinary actions is foregrounded. Okay. We don't encounter bureaucracy. We encounter offices. We encounter offices with people on the other side of the window. And we encounter queues. Okay? So a bureaucracy, or an institution, to be precise, bureaucracy is, of course, in more abstract terms, but an institution is a bundle of a number of practices. And we know from Goffman some will be organized is a front office, some will be in the back office, but in back office you don't find abstract principle. You find just more of the same. You will find people typing, filing, people having meetings. So an institution, from a practice perspective, is nothing but an assemblage, a conglomerate, a unions of ordinary actions like queuing. Okay? The little movie helps you sort of see a number of things, other things that practice theory sort of this approaching this world in the perspective foregrounds. For example, the fact that knowledge and intelligibility, okay, are not something which are living in abstract. It's something very situated. So knowledgeability is in the moment, situated, okay? Where do I go? In which of these two queues do I go? Okay, so And in many ways, it's the practice of queuing that selects the knowledge which is useful. Knowing mathematics is not useful if you're in a queue. Okay? There are other types of knowledge that are useful. It shows that if you take a practice theory approach, intelligibility, what it makes sense to do, okay, and shared sort of decisions, sort of like what do I make to do in relation to what other people think what it's appropriate to do. It's much more useful to make sense of what's going on in the queuing example than, for example, decisions. It will be very hard, even for the hardest-nosed behavioral science, to think that that person was deciding before acting, which is the typical assumptions of the Cartesian paradigms, right? That we have mental scheme, etc. So practice theory, this approach offers you a different ways of thinking in terms of what is knowledge, what is intelligibility. Other things that come out is the importance of the body. Okay, as you can see, moving in the body, okay, thinking with the body, I think it's pretty obvious. Okay, this person was thinking with the body and making attempts with the body. So and if you are northern persons, I am from Southern Europe, I can assure you that the embodied competence of learning which of the cues move fast is survival. Okay? Body and artifacts. Okay, in this particular view we see from the above, so we don't have, but the fact that there is a window. Okay, so that the person has to go inside the window. The fact that the window has a small hole, and in order to speak with the person to the other side, you have to your sounds go through the holes. So the importance that in this setup, the shape of the place comes to the foreground. Remember, the little mouse has to try to ask the questions inside, but it has to go to the top because there is a piece of glass. Okay. Other things that come out from these examples, they're typical of the practice approach. The centralities of process, durations, and sequence. Okay, so that if you look at the worlds as emerging from ordinary actions, you start to think in terms of sequence. One thing, and this is of course ethnomethodology, conversation analysis, one thing after the other. We don't plan ahead. Okay, the centrality of process means that for the practitioner, the questions is formulated very differently from that of academics, and this is again per Bourdieu, and again I'll leave it to Robert tomorrow, but okay, so for the practitioner, the question is, what do I do next? And of course, what do I do next depends on what other people are doing and what have just done, okay? Which also means that if you take this practice approach and if you focus on situated actions and if you focus on this sequence, the idea of context changes radically. Okay, even in some of the more advanced social theories that are contextually sensitive still think of context as a container, as sort of like the backdrop that happens. But if you think of the queuing, okay, the context changes every time the person moves. The context, the conditions, the situation changes. So the situation is continually evolving. Okay. So the context is actually selected by the practice, by the sequence. So there is no determination. So the context stops to determine. You cannot say that the context determines anything because it's the practice that selects the context. And every time you do a move, your context changes. Okay. And the final thing, of course, is that, as you can see, or maybe you didn't see, is that practice puts people in places. The practice of queuing in an office creates positions of authority. The person behind the person behind the glass has authority. This authority is not something that comes from the sky, it's not something that comes from abstract. It's created by the practice. The practice positions people clearly and gives people different positions. And as long as you have a queue in front of an office, you will have this authority. So the authority of bureaucrats doesn't come from principle, doesn't come from special things that happen in Amsterdam and Den Haag. is built every day on these particular mundane things. Okay. So let me just tease you before getting to the conclusions. Let me tease you. So, okay. So the questions that usually come at this point, and of course I'm preaching to the converts in many ways, but if you were some serious, real, hard-nosed behavioral scientist or proper North American sociologist or functionalist, you will be shaking your head, okay? And at this point, somebody will raise your hand and says, okay, so you are a relativist, you know. If the world is made of ordinary actions, if, you know, everything, anything goes, right? So there is no solidity. Where is reality? Okay, so we lost it. Okay, so, right? Well, let's see. I'm an empirical researcher, so I cannot show you my doctors because they don't allow me to show you, so another little gadget. Let's see if, look in the world of practice, anything goes. The answer is no. So it's a very British thing, okay? So this is very important because, again, this is a joke, okay? But it's not so a joke. So, okay? 3 remarks. So first of all, it reminds ourselves that practices are social. Practices are practices for a group of people, okay? And again, we come back to this, as I said. So practice only counts as such where there is a constituency. Constituency in England is the people who elect the person in parliament, to which the person responds to, okay? So there's no such a thing as an individual practice, and this, of course, we learn from Ludwig Wittgenstein. No such a thing, okay? But which means that a practice is always something in the making. It's only an open project. What counts as a practice is always discussed, okay? And in all, and the constituents of a practice will interactively uphold the principles of, or upheld, how to say, let's put it this properly. So the constituency of a practice are the owners of the normativity contained in it. So every practice, there is the right and wrong way of doing it, okay? You just saw the wrong way of staying in a queue, okay? And so what is right and wrong in the practice is always discussable, okay? So can you have, for example, your spouse holding your place for you? Okay? Is this allowed or not? Yeah, but you're shaking your shoulder, so sometimes yes, sometimes no, okay? Can you leave your bag and go away? Okay? Okay? Now, can you leave your tent and go away? Tent? Okay? Yes, if you go to Wimbledon, you go in the night, okay? You have to queue for 24 hours. You put your tent in the queue because you sleep. As long as your tent is there where you're valuable, you have a place in the queue. Okay? Now, of course, if you put a tent in an office in a bureaucracy, you will be, maybe it doesn't work. So what I'm trying to say, there is always a right or wrong way of doing it. So practice comes with a strong normativity sense. The normativity sense, what is the normativity sense? We come back, we have a discussion tomorrow, okay? So not everything goes in the practice. And the word, in fact, the word of practice is more, so practice is better displayed in normativity because normativity is socially controlled, is socially related. You've seen how norms, you don't need to mobilize great norms a principle abstract, okay? If you do something that other people find are unacceptable, they'll shoot you, okay? So, which also means that practices are never the same. They're always evolving. And we can come back to this in the next few days. There are a variety of theories that talk about the evolutions, but the fact, the challenge for practitioners is that of repeating the same practice every day. I have in the management school, there are millions of people studying routines. Most of them don't know what they're doing, to be honest, but some of them, okay? And the question is, how do you produce, people in factories, how do you produce the same refrigerators day on day on day, okay? Because if you let it practice, you will have different refrigerators every day, which is the beauty of art. This is a different discussion. Okay. So, I hope that these two examples brought home. So, a theory method package with some assumptions, and when you start to use these assumptions to looking at things like bureaucracy, you start to look at different things. You don't see bureaucracy, you see queuing. I have a colleague here that's called Wagener. He's a political science. He's now currently in Nottingham, but he's a Dutch political scientist. He's been doing a lot of work about making a case. Okay, the police and the social services built on creating a case. Okay? That is a critical practice for social service. What is a case? Doing social service is what is a case. Doing home visits, doing inspections. Okay, these are what makes social service. This is what you see if you do the approach. Okay, you start to foreground all these aspects. Ordinary actions, situated intelligibility, shared understanding, the role of the body, what the environment as a physical environment and artifacts do, what work they do. Okay? What is the sequence? How different practices interfere? What power positions or empowering positions or disempowering positions practice do? Okay? And you also start to see how practice evolve over time and how practitioners do both. They try both to stabilize practices or to change them. Okay? So at the end of this game, you end up with a view of things like bureaucracy, which is, of course, not completely different from others because we're looking at the same thing, or we're looking, okay, but which makes you see things that other things are like, like an ideal type approach like that of Max Weber, who in its own way is one of the most powerful tools we have. Okay? So you see radically different things. And if you remember, that was the challenge we set ourselves at the beginning. Practice theory is worth pursuing if you give you something that other approaches don't give you. Okay? So let me conclude very briefly with 5 current challenges of practice theory. And I said I will go through this very quickly because I think this can be the topic for some of the conversations. And so the first challenge, sorry, I'm using 2 computers, so I have to align the 2. So the first challenge is moving beyond philosophy, okay? And this can be a little bit of a sort of self-referential things because I spent some time with people who are sort of like, I've been doing this game for a while. There's a lot of talk of philosophy. So embracing the practice approach is different from discussing practice theory, okay? So Theodor Shasky said it's very good for people to take 2 days off, reflect on their ontological assumptions. Ask yourself, what type of view of the world am I using? Am I using a theory method package that is actually coherent, or do I have methods that do different things? So reflection is good. The problem is if you just then continue the reflections after, you never move somewhere else, and you continue to discuss after you leave the 2 days, instead of going back to your place of work or place of research and looking at the phenomenon with different eyes, you continue discussing endlessly what is the boundary of a practice, okay? Which is, of course, part of a different traditions, okay? Functional traditions need to start with definitions, But because the definitions is what will lead then, this created the box and the arrows, okay? So this, for me, the first challenge is that remaining authentic to the fact that doing practice theory is not getting involved in endless semantic exercise of what is a practice, what is not a practice, the difference between practice and praxis, okay? Which is, as I said, something that can be done in passing. But just staying authentic to the fact that I said before is approaching the social phenomena with the expectation that they emerge from regimes of ordinary actions. So the first challenge is trying to, and I think the 2 days here will be useful for this, to move from the elaborations of the ontology to start to put ontology to work. Okay? My view is that a good ontology is elaborated through applications. So we use these things, we go in the fields, we find that it doesn't work, we come back and we invite new concepts. So, and this is a challenge for everybody in the room, that will have to be disciplined not only to do semantic exercise and talk in abstract, okay, but try to connect with our research or what interventions, whatever you do. So my suggestions in terms of linguistic therapy, against to use a term from Wittgenstein, is use examples. Okay, let's not talk about practice. Okay, let's talk about cooking or doing injections or helping a person to die. You will see that the discussion takes a completely different stance. Second challenge, I'm almost finished. Okay. Moving beyond enumeration studies. This is very much something which I didn't know who I will meet here, so I mentioned. In my community, at least, very often people call practice studies studies when they go in the new place and they sort of like try to see what people do, and then they give it a name that the practitioner don't understand. Usually, okay, so, and they count 6, 7, 8 practices. So nursing is about caring, I don't know, some coordinating, and okay, communicating, and of course you take to the nurses says, what do you mean with communicating? Oh, you talk with a lot of people. Oh, I see, I understand, okay. And so nursing is 11 practices, okay, and then you come home and you say, you know, the different. And so nursing is built on 11 practices, and this is how these practices work together. As I said, this is becoming increasingly common in my community. I don't know if it's common in your community. Now, this is going to be the death of this practice approach. It's going to be dying. And it's going to be dying for 2 reasons. First, because the practitioner will look in the eyes and it says, so what? Okay, so you describe my work in a way which is, I don't understand, and which is much less, it doesn't capture the complexity, okay? So first thing. The second thing is that this assumes that practice theory is about describing what people do. Now, there is a discussion within practice theory we'll pick up tomorrow about the role of ethnography, but ethnography itself is not a method. Ethnography is itself in ontology, that thinks that the world is created by ordinary actions and ordinary meaning-making actions. Okay? So it's ignorant scholars who think that ethnography is just going and looking at things. Okay? So the idea here is the challenge is that practice approach needs to be used for something else. So you use the practice palette, this practice toolkit, in order to explain something else, to explain why the nurses and the doctors cannot speak, to understand why a certain technology was taken up or not taken up, okay? For example, just to give you an example, I'm doing 2 major pieces of work. One, we are following the emergence of a new way of doing heart surgery. I can give you details, okay? And there is a competition between different consortia of practice. So there are different assemblages that are competing. Okay, and depending on which of these assemblages, you can see this new practice taken up faster or slower in certain hospital. Okay, so we are looking this technology in terms of assemblage of sort of like assemblage But in order to explain how fast and where it works, where it penetrates faster. Okay? In another study I've just finished, we're trying to understand how director of hospital makes sense of their information. They're bombarded by information all the time. How do they make sense of it? How they navigate the information? Again, so we spent 1 month with each of them, and Gerard knows about this story. The practice things was not just of describing what is practice. We're interested to understand how these people make sense. And we came up with a number of ways of doing that help these people navigate their sort of like this overflow of information. But the idea is that we are using practice theory as a dispositive, as an arrangement, as a machine for explaining something else. Okay? Very quickly, because I'm running out of time. The third challenge for practice theory is, of course, for that of accounting for big issues, the big issues of sociology. Practice theory's practice approach has been traditionally very good at dealing with local things, the queuing, okay? They're making a case, cooking, washing. The challenge is still to address in bigger bites. Now, the problem, of course, is that one thing is claiming that a bureaucracy or institutions like the Ministry of Education is made of practices like opening the door, okay? One thing is going from this to then say something about the directions of the Dutch education, okay? So this is a challenge that people are starting to address. We'll come back again tomorrow. Just to mention again, there are three ways in which these things is approached. One, which we'll see tomorrow, which is sort of like thinking that and taking a sort of actor network or Latourian approach, that there's no such a thing as big phenomena. The big phenomena are just compositions or small phenomena connected between one and the other. The model is that of the rhizome. So it's studying institutions as local manifestations. So this will be the, so you will, if you want to look at how the curriculum in Dutch schools, okay, you have to understand that the curriculum was created in a number of meetings, and then these meetings produces a piece of paper, then went to another meeting, so you actually just connect one meeting to another, okay? We'll leave the others for tomorrow, but one question is also, okay, of course, if you are practice theorists, is such a thing as a large phenomena, okay? Is bureaucracy something that existed before some sociologist, which was not, of course, Weber, give it a name? Okay, it's just an invention of philosophers or sociologists that politicians that have hijacked in order to fulfill their sort of controlling dreams. As you know, there is there's been a lot of stories, a lot of research on the birth of statistics, and in the connection between statistics and actuarial, so insurance things, as way in which first business people trying to create large views of society in order to make money, and then this view was sort of like appropriated by the politicians, okay? So is practice theory just calling the game in the sense that, okay, these are creations, and queuing, after all, I mean, can you think of, forget about queuing, think about the bureaucratic office. Is there something which is more global, okay, than an office? I have pictures here of people who have offices in the North Pole. Okay, if you want to go in a walk on the North Pole, you have to go to a Lapland. There is an office when you have to get an authorizations to go to the park. Okay, so you can see these people all dressed like Eskimos, okay, with the reindeers outside, and you will see the same things of the mouse, which was actually done in Argentina. So the bureaucratic office, okay, surveyed at the window, is a practice which is global. It doesn't come bigger than that. So we are already looking at this. And finally, okay, two things. Fourth things is that we still lack accounts of power effects, and we know that the practice theory, the idea of the practice position people, the practice create imbalances, the idea is good, seems very promising, but nobody still have done a proper sort of study. We're still lacking a good, so this is actually a niche, okay? So how can we reframe? And of course, again, let's not forget that some of the things we're doing is just finishing the work of Michel Foucault, and we can talk about these things later on. Okay, what Foucault called discourse was not discourse at all, okay? So discourse was actually social and material, was actually very much what we call practices. Of course, Foucault was not interested, he never went down to the ground, okay? He was seeing the connections. The microphysics of power is about queuing, okay? So Foucault would say that actually exactly what I said. He would agree completely. The fact that the power is both in the setup of the office and in the discipline. Did you remember? No, okay? In both examples, power is interiorized by the people who nobody tell them to stay in the queue. Okay, actually, paradoxically, there's nobody with a gun telling to stay one behind the other. Actually, the gun is used when somebody is indisciplined. Okay? So in many ways, practice theory starts where Foucault stopped. But yet, we haven't had our own Foucault yet. So maybe it's in this room. And final things, and apologies for overrunning, I'm about 10 minutes late. The final thing is that, and again, we'll pick up later, the great risk of practice theory is that this approach just becomes another form of academic voyeurism. So we go in a place, we look at people, we take notes of what they do, and then we come home. And again, here we'll discuss this because there are people who are using this. We can discuss this tomorrow. Sorry, I'm postponing this, but we'll have time to discuss. I think this is very important things. I think there is a sense among people doing practice theory that adding another voyeuristic approach, it's really a pity. Okay? And there have been initial ways in which practice theory has been used for producing or try to generate social change, mostly at two levels. First, at macro level, especially the community who deals with sustainability and sustainable consumption, the consumption study, which is one of the communities that embrace practice theory earlier than others. They've been trying to convince policymakers, okay, that the way in which to address sustainability, ecology, and is that of taking a practice approach. Okay, in England the other day, the Guardian ran a story where one of American new poors, a person with a degree that have to do 2 jobs in order to survive, and written a story which apparently made a lot of the news in the US. She explains what are the practices, okay, and the assemblage of practices that keep people poor, okay? So, and she's trying to counteract the idea that people are poor because they're stupid or because they make their own decisions. And she shows that the number of the practices, the management of where she works, and the practice that she's forced to do. So if you don't have a bank account, okay, you cannot pay your bills online, and therefore you pay more for your bills than you have a bank account, okay? Which means that then you don't have money to pay for something else, which then means that you have no money and your credit history is turned, and then you don't have a bank account, okay? So attacking poverty is not about convincing people, it's not about nudging people with new behavioral things. It's about looking what are the practices that keep people in poverty, and then starting to change the practices. Okay? So that's one level. And another level that we can discuss is things like myself, there's Gary here, there are other people in this country like Jessica Messman in Maastricht, who have been starting to use instead practice theory at the more local level. And using practice theory to start reflection processes with practitioner, group of practitioners. Okay, so practice theory is a language to help practitioners reflect and intervene in their own activities. And we can discuss this. Challenge is opened, okay? As I said, they come with the territory. I hope we'll have time to go more in deep in some of these challenges during the conversation these days. Thank you for your patience.